You are not qualified to work at Harrison Properties. I would be terrified to even let you pour the coffee, my father announced, throwing my business rescue plan onto the dining room floor. I simply picked up my wine glass and took a sip. He had no idea that as a senior partner at Vanguard Holdings, I held the power to approve or destroy his desperate $80 million bailout. My name is Vivian, and I am 34 years old. For my entire life, my family treated me like the ultimate failure because I chose quiet ambition over flashy designer labels. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, appearances were the only currency that mattered in my family. My father, Richard, built a commercial real estate firm from the ground up. He demanded perfection, but his definition of perfection was entirely superficial. Our massive estate, complete with a 6-car garage and an indoor pool, was a monument to his ego. The Thanksgiving dinner table was no different. Crystal glasses caught the light from the enormous chandelier overhead, and the smell of roasted turkey and expensive sage dressing filled the air. But underneath the facade of wealth, Harrison Properties was bleeding cash, drowning in toxic debt due to years of gross mismanagement. I knew this because evaluating distressed assets was my actual profession. I had spent the last week pulling late nights at my office drafting a comprehensive restructuring plan to save my father from an impending Chapter 11 bankruptcy. I brought the thick, carefully bound folder to Thanksgiving dinner as an olive branch, hoping to finally earn a seat at the table. Instead, my father barely glanced at the executive summary before tossing it aside. The heavy folder hit the mahogany table and slid off the edge, scattering printed financial projections across the imported Persian rug. "Business is a man's game, Vivian," my father said, his face flushed with expensive bourbon. "You do not have the stomach for it. You live alone in a rented apartment, you drive a practical sedan, and you have zero understanding of how real wealth operates. In fact, your mother and I have spoken with our lawyers. We are restructuring our estate. You are being completely cut out of the inheritance. We cannot risk you squandering our legacy because you lack basic financial literacy." I sat perfectly still, listening to the man whose company was technically insolvent lecture me about financial literacy. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I just looked at the scattered papers on the floor. My older brother, Bradley, leaned back in his chair and laughed. He was the recently appointed CEO of Harrison Properties, a title he had earned simply by being the firstborn son. Just last month, his sheer incompetence had cost the company a $5 million contract, but in this house his failures were always swept under the rug. Bradley stroked the gold face of his heavy Rolex watch, a piece of jewelry likely purchased with company funds. "Leave the corporate strategy to the heavyweights," little sister Bradley mocked, taking a slow sip of his drink. "You should stick to whatever modest accounting job pays for your little apartment. Harrison Properties requires aggressive leadership. We are about to close a massive capital injection that will double our portfolio. We do not need some timid spinster telling us how to run an empire." The chorus of humiliation did not end there. Across the table sat my younger sister Sloane and her husband Trey. Trey was a 35-year-old African-American former stockbroker who had lost his license years ago, but he still walked around with the unearned arrogance of a Wall Street titan. He lived entirely off the corporate credit cards my father handed out, contributing absolutely nothing to the business while reaping all the rewards. Trey chuckled, shaking his head as he aggressively cut into his turkey. "Bradley is right," Trey chimed in, pointing his fork directly at me. "Look at you, Vivian. 34, no husband, no ring, dressing like you are about to attend a funeral. A woman's value drops real fast when she stops caring about her presentation. You should take notes from my beautiful wife here. Sloane knows how to carry herself. She knows how to spend money to make money. That is why she secured a man who can provide the luxury she absolutely deserves." Sloane smirked, reaching up to adjust a diamond necklace that I knew for a fact was charged to the company's marketing expense account. She looked at me with pure pity. Trey is just being honest, Vivian. You are so secretive and closed off. We never even know what you actually do for a living. You cannot blame Dad for wanting to protect the family assets from someone who clearly has no ambition. My mother, Catherine, sat at the opposite end of the table, cutting her food with delicate, precise movements. She was the ultimate enabler, a woman who cared only about maintaining her status at the local country club and keeping up appearances for her wealthy friends. Now let us not ruin the holiday, Catherine said softly, though there was no defense for me in her tone. Vivian, be a dear and pick up those papers from the floor. You know how your father hates a mess. They had no idea. They had never bothered to ask the name of the firm where I worked. They just assumed I was a low-level number cruncher because I did not flash designer bags or demand a nepotism position in their failing company. They did not know that for the past 7 years I had ruthlessly climbed the ranks at Vanguard Holdings, one of the most aggressive private equity firms in the country. I was a senior partner specializing in hostile takeovers and corporate restructuring. My rented apartment was a luxury penthouse downtown, and my practical sedan was just my daily driver to avoid unwanted attention. I slowly bent down and gathered the scattered pages of my rescue plan. I tapped the edges against the table to straighten them, then placed the folder neatly on my lap. I understand completely, I said, keeping my voice smooth and totally professional. I will not interfere with Harrison Properties ever again. Trey let out a loud, booming laugh that echoed through the dining room. Good girl. Now you are finally learning your place. I offered them a polite, empty smile, letting them bask in their temporary victory. I knew something they did not. The massive capital injection Bradley had bragged about was a desperate $80 million loan application submitted directly to my firm. And on Monday morning, that exact file would be sitting right on my mahogany desk, waiting for my personal signature. The grand Thanksgiving dinner slowly wound down, leaving behind a trail of half-eaten exorbitant dishes and empty crystal wine glasses. My family had gorged themselves on imported truffles, butter-poached lobster, and multiple bottles of vintage Cabernet. They ordered with the reckless abandon of people who believed their wealth was infinite, completely blind to the fact that their corporate accounts were running on fumes. The waiter approached the table, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, carrying a sleek black leather folder. He naturally moved toward the head of the table where my father sat, but my mother intercepted him with a swift manicured hand. Catherine took the leather folder and, without even glancing at the total, slid it directly across the polished mahogany wood until it bumped against my water glass. I looked down at the receipt. The total was $4,500. I raised my eyes to meet my mother's gaze, waiting for the punchline. There was no joke. Her expression was perfectly composed, carrying that signature blend of maternal disappointment and absolute entitlement. You live alone in that little apartment, Vivian, my mother said, smoothing her silk napkin over her lap. You have no husband to look after, no children to feed, and absolutely no real financial responsibilities to speak of. Your father and your brother are carrying the immense weight of the family business on their shoulders. Trey and Sloan are building their beautiful life together. It is only fair that you show some gratitude for everything we have provided you. Paying for this dinner is the least you can do to repay us. You need to learn how to be useful to this family. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the sound of Trey shifting in his chair. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head in mock sympathy. $4,000 is a lot for a single woman on a basic salary, Trey said, flashing a patronizing grin. Do not worry, Vivian. If your debit card declines, I can spot you a few hundred. Just do not make it a habit. My company credit card has a pretty high limit, but I prefer to spend it on my wife. Sloan giggled, leaning into Trey's shoulder and admiring her freshly manicured nails. I stared at the bill. $4,500. It was a sum that would bankrupt an ordinary person, and my family was actively trying to humiliate me, assuming I would have to beg for their help to cover it. They wanted to watch me sweat. They wanted to see the family failure scramble to pay for their gluttony. I did not argue. I did not flinch. I reached into my designer clutch a limited edition piece they had completely failed to recognize and pulled out my wallet. I slid my fingers over the heavy, cool titanium of my American Express Centurion Black card. It was an invitation-only card reserved for the top tier of high-net-worth individuals, a card with absolutely no preset spending limit. I kept my thumb strategically placed over the distinctive branding, ensuring they could only see the dark, unmarked edge of the metal. I slipped it inside the leather folder and handed it back to the waiter. When the waiter returned a few moments later, his entire demeanor had shifted. He handed the folder back to me with a deep, almost reverent bow, his eyes wide with profound respect. "Thank you very much, madam," he said softly, his tone filled with absolute deference. "We deeply appreciate your business this evening." I signed the slip, adding a generous $1,000 tip, and closed the folder. My family was too busy discussing their upcoming ski trip to Aspen to notice the waiter's reaction. They simply assumed I had just drained my entire life savings to appease them. I stood up from the table, smoothing the front of my tailored suit. "Thank you for the dinner invitation," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "I hope the $80 million capital injection you are waiting for comes through Bradley. It would be a shame to see Harrison Properties liquidated before Christmas." My father scowled, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "Get home safely, Vivian. And try to dress better next time. You are representing the Harrison name, even if you are not part of the business." I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room without another word. The heavy oak front doors closed behind me, shutting out the suffocating toxicity of my family. I stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The bitter wind whipped across my face, and thick white snowflakes were falling rapidly, blanketing the manicured lawns of the upscale neighborhood. The extreme cold felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. I walked down the long, illuminated driveway toward my understated sedan, a vehicle I intentionally chose to keep my wealth completely off their radar. Just as I unlocked my car door, my phone began to vibrate violently in my coat pocket. The caller ID displayed the name Cameron, my senior executive assistant at Vanguard Holdings. Cameron knew my strict rules about calling during the holidays. If he was calling me at 9 o'clock on Thanksgiving night, the financial world was either ending or a massive deal had just landed on the chopping block. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine to get the heater running, and answered the call. "Speak," I said sharply. "I sincerely apologize for the interruption," Boss Cameron said, his voice tight with professional urgency. But an emergency acquisition file just bypassed the standard underwriting portal and was flagged directly for upper management. A commercial real estate firm is begging for an immediate lifeline. They are facing an $80 million default by Monday morning. The bank is threatening to pull their credit lines, and if they do not secure a private equity bailout by the end of the weekend, they are going straight into federal bankruptcy court. I watched the snow accumulate on my windshield, my eyes narrowing in the darkness. The irony of the situation was almost cinematic. I took a deep breath, letting the icy air from the vents clear my mind. "What is the exact name of the firm Cameron Harrison Properties?" Cameron replied, reading from the urgent dossier. "The current CEO is listed as Bradley Harrison, but the primary guarantor is Richard Harrison. They are requesting an $80 million cash injection. They claim their portfolio is robust, but our initial algorithmic scan shows massive liabilities, inflated asset valuations, and severe cash flow hemorrhaging. They are desperate, boss. They are asking Vanguard Holdings to save them." A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. The sheer poetry of this moment was beautiful. The very people who had just spent the last 3 hours calling me a useless, unqualified failure were currently begging my company for survival. They had no idea that Vanguard Holdings was not just a faceless corporate entity. They had no idea that I was the senior partner who controlled the mergers and acquisitions division. I held the absolute power of life and death over their entire empire. "Cameron," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly, calculated whisper, Flag that application for my personal review. Lock out all other partners from accessing this specific file. I want you to initiate the most aggressive due diligence protocol Vanguard Holdings has ever executed. Dig into every single corporate account, every offshore shell company, and every personal expense filed by the executive board. Do not leave a single stone unturned. Understood, Boss Cameron replied without hesitation. Do you want me to authorize the standard term sheet? Absolutely not. I instructed shifting my car into gear. I am going to handle this negotiation personally. If they want Vanguard's money, they are going to bleed for it. Prepare a hostile restructuring agreement. I want everything they own put up as collateral. I will see you in the office first thing tomorrow morning. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the passenger seat. As I drove away from my parents' sprawling estate, leaving their arrogant laughter behind in the snow, my mind was already executing a flawless financial trap. I was going to strip them of their arrogance dollar by dollar. My father had confidently stated that I lacked the stomach for business. He was about to find out just how ruthless his discarded daughter could truly be. 3 weeks had passed since the Thanksgiving disaster. I was sitting in my corner office on the 50th floor of the Vanguard Holdings tower, the Chicago skyline sprawling out beneath my floor-to-ceiling windows. My massive mahogany desk was impeccably organized, holding only one physical file: the Harrison Properties bailout application. Over the past 21 days, my underwriting team had ruthlessly dissected my father's business. The financial autopsy revealed a corporation bleeding out from severe mismanagement, highly inflated executive salaries, and absolute gross negligence. I was currently calculating the exact liquidation value of their commercial real estate assets when my personal cell phone lit up. A priority notification popped onto my screen. It was an email forwarded directly from my younger sister Sloane. Attached was a finalized invoice from the Four Seasons Resort in Maui, Hawaii. I clicked open the PDF document, my eyes scanning the ridiculous itemized list of charges: oceanfront presidential suite, daily couples massages, imported champagne, private yacht charters, and an absurd amount of high-end boutique shopping. The grand total sitting at the bottom of the final page was $30,450. Before I could process the sheer audacity of this email, my phone began ringing. The caller ID displayed Trey, my highly arrogant brother-in-law. I let it ring 3 times, enjoying the brief moment of sweet silence before pressing the answer button and putting him on speakerphone. Vivian Trey barked, his voice loud and echoing with the distinct sound of crashing ocean waves in the background. Tell me you got the invoice. I need you to wire those funds to the resort's account immediately. The concierge is holding our luggage until the balance is fully cleared. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, steepling my fingers together. I received an invoice for a $30,000 Hawaiian vacation tray. I am struggling to understand why it was sent to my personal inbox. Because your father froze the corporate cards. Trey snapped, his tone laced with heavy irritation and extreme entitlement. We are dealing with a temporary cash flow shortage at Harrison Properties. It is just a minor liquidity hiccup. Sloane and I needed this luxury getaway to relieve some intense stress. And since you sit around in your cheap apartment hoarding your little paycheck, you are going to cover this. Consider it your primary duty to support the family during a transitional phase. A transitional phase, I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm octave. You booked a $30,000 luxury vacation while the family business is literally starving for capital, and you expect me to foot the bill because you completely maxed out your corporate allowance. Listen to me very carefully, Vivian Trey sneered, his vast arrogance completely blinding him to the harsh reality of his situation. I am not asking you. I am telling you. You need to step up and serve this family right now. I have been putting in massive overtime for Harrison Properties. In fact, I just secured the ultimate financial lifeline. I finally made a major connection with a top-tier executive at Vanguard Holdings. I raised an eyebrow, a cold, sharp smile touching my lips. Is that right? You made a massive connection at Vanguard Holdings. That is exactly right, Trey boasted, his chest puffing out even through the digital phone line. I bypassed the low-level analysts and got straight to the heavy hitters. We are finalizing an $80 million capital injection by the end of the month. The Vanguard executives practically begged us to take their money once they saw my brilliant projections. When that $80 million drops into our accounts, Harrison Properties is going to totally dominate the Midwest real estate market. So you will pay this resort bill right now, and when we are flush with cash, maybe I will convince your father to reimburse you. If you know what is good for you, you will stop asking questions and wire the cash. The sheer level of delusion was absolutely staggering. Trey, a washed-up former broker who had not closed a legitimate financial deal in several years, actually believed he was successfully maneuvering the deadly sharks at Vanguard. He had absolutely no idea that the top-tier executive he claimed to be fiercely negotiating with was sitting right on the other end of this phone call. He did not know that his $80 million dream was currently resting securely under my manicured fingertips, waiting to be ruthlessly shredded. Trey. I said, my voice completely devoid of any human emotion. I am not wiring you a single cent. You and Sloan can wash dirty dishes in the resort kitchen to pay off your massive champagne tab for all I care. I will absolutely not subsidize your catastrophic financial incompetence. There was a sharp, aggressive intake of breath on the other end of the line. The background sound of the ocean waves seemed to freeze completely. What did you just say to me? Trey growled, his voice dropping into a vicious, threatening, and angry register. You listen to me, you pathetic spinster. You are going to pay this bill today, or I swear to God I will make sure Richard permanently cuts you out of this family forever. You think you can talk down to a man like me? I am the one saving this entire empire. When that 80 million clears, you are going to be crawling to my office begging me for a minimum wage job as a receptionist. You are nothing. You hear me? Absolute nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not match his frantic, pathetic anger. Instead, I delivered a highly calculated surgical verbal strike. If your secret connection at Vanguard Holdings is so incredibly powerful, Trey, why do you not ask them to front you the $30,000? I am sure your imaginary executive friends would love to know that their future business partner is currently stranded in Hawaii, completely unable to afford his own luggage. Have a terrible flight home. I pressed the end call button, severing the aggressive connection immediately. I placed my phone face down on the polished desk, the total silence of my private office rushing back in to replace his toxic, unhinged shouting. I knew exactly what I had just done. By refusing to pay, and by directly mocking his highly fragile, artificially inflated ego, I had backed a deeply desperate, highly arrogant man directly into a tight corner. Trey was a classic narcissist who violently survived on the false illusion of immense wealth and untouchable power. Stripping him of that fake illusion, especially in front of his highly demanding wife, would definitely be the ultimate psychological trigger. My firm refusal to submit to his pathetic blackmail was not just about the actual money. It was a deeply calculated psychological push. A man exactly like Trey, suddenly faced with intense public humiliation at a premier luxury resort and a fully frozen corporate bank account, would not just gracefully accept defeat. He would panic terribly. And when a proud man with zero morals and massive hidden debts severely panics, he rapidly makes catastrophic, highly illegal financial mistakes. I turned my sharp attention back to the Harrison Properties confidential dossier sitting on my desk. The deadly trap was now perfectly set. I had just confidently lit the explosive fuse, and now all I essentially had to do was patiently wait for the massive explosion. Trey's completely unhinged anger was about to directly drive him straight into the darkest, most irreversible financial crime of his entire pathetic existence. And I would be happily watching every single destructive step. Less than an hour after my altercation with Trey, the polished surface of my desk vibrated as my phone lit up again. This time, the caller ID displayed my father, Richard. I knew exactly what was coming. Trey had undoubtedly called him in a panic, spinning a false narrative of my supposed cruelty to cover up his own humiliating financial predicament. I pressed the answer button, leaning back in my chair and waiting for the storm to hit. You are a cold-blooded, selfish, ungrateful disappointment, Richard bellowed through the speaker, not even bothering with a customary greeting. His voice was ragged with fury, the kind of absolute rage reserved only for when someone threatened his carefully constructed image of family wealth. Trey and Sloan are stranded in Maui because of a minor bank error, and you refuse to float them a petty $30,000. You deliberately humiliated your sister and your brother-in-law. You intentionally embarrassed this entire family. I kept my breathing steady, staring out at the towering skyscrapers of Chicago. Trey demanded that I pay for a luxury vacation he could not afford, while your company is currently facing a massive liquidity crisis, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured. That is not a minor bank error. That is gross financial negligence. You know absolutely nothing about corporate finance, Richard roared, slamming his hand against what sounded like his heavy oak desk. We are securing an $80 million deal with Vanguard Holdings this week. We are about to be wealthier than we have ever been. But you could not look past your own petty jealousy for 1 second to help your family. You have always been a bitter, jealous spinster who hates seeing her siblings succeed. He did not stop to take a breath. He was unleashing decades of deep-seated disdain, finally saying out loud what he had implied my entire life. I am absolutely done with you, Vivian. Do you hear me? You are no longer my daughter. I am officially cutting you off from this family. I am completely disowning you. Furthermore, you are permanently banned from the Harrison Properties headquarters. If you ever try to show your face at my company again, I will have security throw you out onto the pavement. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. His harsh words intended to break my spirit only fueled my absolute resolve. I understand completely, I said softly, the lethal irony of the situation burning bright in my chest. I will never step foot inside Harrison Properties as your daughter again. I ended the call. The silence in my office was absolute, a stark contrast to the venom my father had just spewed. He had just officially disowned the only person on earth who held the keys to his salvation. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the direct line to Cameron, my senior executive assistant. Cameron, I commanded, my voice sharp and entirely devoid of emotion. Bring the underwriting team lead into my office immediately. We are finalizing the term sheet for the Harrison Properties bailout. Within 2 minutes, Cameron and my lead risk analyst stood at attention in front of my desk. They held the thick dossiers containing the financial ruin of my former family. I stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the bustling streets 50 stories below. Harrison Properties is desperate. I began turning to face my team. They believe this $80 million capital injection is a guaranteed lifeline. I want to shatter that illusion, but I want to do it legally and methodically. We are going to approve the preliminary stages of the loan, but we are attaching the most draconian, punishing collateral requirements Vanguard Holdings has ever drafted. My risk analyst nodded, his pen hovering over his notepad. What specific assets are we targeting, boss? Everything, I said, a cold smile forming on my lips. I do not just want their commercial real estate portfolio. Their commercial assets are over-leveraged garbage. I want absolute personal liability. The term sheet must explicitly state that the $80 million will only be released if Richard Harrison puts up his primary residence, the family mansion, as collateral. Furthermore, I want his entire personal retirement fund legally bound to the agreement. Cameron looked slightly surprised but quickly masked it. That is highly unusual for a corporate restructuring deal of this size. It essentially strips the CEO of all personal financial protection. If they default, they lose their home and their life savings. That is exactly the point, I replied, walking back to my desk and tapping the Harrison file. We are not stopping there. I want Bradley Harrison tied to this as well. Mandate that his personal assets, including his luxury vehicles and private investment accounts, are also listed as collateral. They want Vanguard's money to fund their lavish lifestyles. They are going to gamble their very existence to get it. Draft the documents tonight, I instructed my team. Use the most aggressive legal jargon possible. Make it completely clear that Vanguard Holdings has the immediate right to seize and liquidate all personal assets upon any breach of contract or discovery of financial misrepresentation. Send the demands to their legal department first thing tomorrow morning. As my team hurried out of my office to execute my orders, I sat back down in my executive chair. The trap was now fully constructed, its steel jaws pulled back and waiting. My father had just disowned me because he firmly believed Vanguard Holdings was going to make him invincible. He was blinded by pure greed, driven by a desperate need to maintain his wealthy facade at the country club. I knew exactly how Richard and Bradley operated. When they received the severe term sheet tomorrow morning, they would panic initially. But their monumental arrogance would quickly override their common sense. They would look at the $80 million dangling right in front of their faces and convince themselves that they were smart enough to beat the system. They would tell themselves that putting up the family mansion and the retirement funds was just a temporary formality, a standard corporate hoop to jump through before they became untouchably rich. They would eagerly sign their own death warrants. By forcing them to leverage their personal lives, I was stripping away the corporate veil that usually protected executives during a bankruptcy proceeding. I was quietly maneuvering them into a position where they had to bet every single thing they owned to survive another month. My father had banned me from his building and stripped me of my family title, but he had just handed me the legal right to completely eradicate his empire. I stared at the freezing Chicago skyline, knowing that the Harrison family was about to willingly walk directly into a financial slaughterhouse. The morning after Vanguard Holdings delivered the revised term sheet, panic swallowed the boardroom at Harrison Properties. My underwriting team calculated the exact value of my father's estate, Bradley's vehicles, and every liquid asset the family possessed. The result was a catastrophic shortfall. Even after pledging the family mansion, the corporate headquarters, and Richard's retirement portfolio, they were severely lacking the required collateral to secure the $80 million lifeline. The math was unforgiving. Vanguard demanded absolute security, and the Harrison family was bankrupt on paper. I sat in my penthouse office receiving real-time digital updates from the data room where my analysts monitored their reactions. Through the secure portal, we tracked their frantic uploads. They were submitting appraisals for depreciating assets, desperately trying to inflate the value of empty strip malls and heavily leveraged residential complexes. None of it was enough. The Vanguard algorithm automatically rejected their pathetic attempts to artificially pad their net worth. They needed a massive, unencumbered, high-value asset before the deadline expired at the end of the week. According to the internal communications my team intercepted through the data room metadata, Trey finally proposed the ultimate criminal solution. Trapped in a corner facing the absolute loss of his corporate credit cards and lavish lifestyle, my arrogant brother-in-law remembered the one piece of pristine real estate that remained untouched by the company's toxic debt. When my grandfather passed away, he saw right through my father's reckless financial behavior. To protect me, he left me a massive, highly coveted parcel of commercial land in the center of a rapidly developing tech corridor. The deed was entirely in my name, locked away in a private trust that shielded it from Harrison Properties. It was worth tens of millions of dollars, completely unencumbered, and possessed the exact premium collateral profile Vanguard required to greenlight the bailout. Bradley and Trey knew about the land. They spent years mocking me for refusing to sell it, calling me an idiot for letting such a valuable asset sit empty. Now that exact piece of land was their only ticket to survival. But there was a massive problem. They had zero legal authority to use it. My father had explicitly banned me from the building and disowned me. Asking me to sign over my inheritance to save their sinking ship was impossible, and they knew I would laugh in their faces. So driven by greed and desperation, they decided to cross the line from gross corporate mismanagement directly into federal financial crime. They convinced themselves I was ignorant of high-level finance. In their arrogant minds, I was just a naive, discarded spinster living in a cheap apartment, disconnected from the aggressive world of commercial real estate. They truly believed I never checked the public registry, never monitored my trust, and would never understand the complex legal paperwork required for a collateral pledge. Trey, utilizing the shady connections from his disgraced days as a stockbroker, procured a corrupt notary public willing to look the other way for a generous cash bribe. Inside the executive suite of Harrison Properties, my brother and my brother-in-law committed a severe federal felony. They drafted a fraudulent power of attorney and a fabricated collateral transfer agreement. Then, with a steady hand and breathtaking entitlement, Bradley deliberately forged my signature on the bottom line. They officially pledged my grandfather's prime commercial real estate to Vanguard Holdings to secure their $80 million bailout. They sealed the fabricated documents inside a thick manila envelope, slapped an overnight shipping label on it, and sent it directly to Vanguard headquarters. They must have celebrated that night. I could imagine Trey and Bradley pouring expensive scotch toasting to their own dark brilliance, convinced they had outsmarted the system and secured their wealthy futures using my stolen property. They thought they had committed the perfect untraceable white-collar crime. 24 hours later, a sleek corporate courier stepped out of the private elevator on the 50th floor of the Vanguard Tower. He handed a heavily sealed certified collateral packet directly to Cameron. My executive assistant did not open it. He simply walked the package straight into my corner office and placed it gently on the center of my polished mahogany desk. The final submission from Harrison Properties. Cameron announced, his voice professional but carrying a distinct edge of anticipation. The legal department ran the initial scan. They managed to close the collateral gap, boss. They submitted a new high-value land deed to secure the remaining balance. I dismissed Cameron with a subtle nod and waited for the heavy glass door to click shut. The silence in my office was absolute. I reached for my silver letter opener and sliced through the thick paper seal. I slid the pristine, legally binding documents out of the envelope and spread them across my desk. There it was. A beautifully drafted, notarized collateral pledge agreement offering my exclusive commercial land to Vanguard Holdings. And right there at the bottom of the final page, resting in dark blue ink, was a flawless forgery of my own signature. I did not feel anger. I did not feel shock. I felt a surge of cold, terrifying power radiate through my veins. By attempting to steal my inheritance to save their fragile egos, Bradley and Trey had handed me the ultimate weapon. They thought they were sending this fraudulent document to a faceless corporate underwriter who would simply stamp it and wire the cash. They had absolutely no idea that the forged signature they just submitted was currently being stared at by the exact woman they had stolen it from. They had not just breached a contract, they had committed massive wire fraud, identity theft, and federal bank fraud. They casually wrapped up a 15-year federal prison sentence and delivered it straight to my desk. I picked up my pen, a dark smile curving on my lips, ready to execute the final phase of my trap. I summoned my elite forensic accounting team. They were apex predators and financial bloodhounds, trained to aggressively sniff out corporate decay and offshore tax evasion. I projected the corporate structure. I looked at Bennett, my lead forensic auditor, and delivered my strict directives. "You are conducting an on-site due diligence review today," I stated. "Your targets are my brother Bradley and my brother-in-law Trey. They believe Vanguard Holdings is sending naive, easily manipulated junior clerks to rubber stamp their bailout. I want you to play exactly that role. You will act thoroughly impressed by their office. You will stroke their massive egos. You will not question their discrepancies to their faces. You will let them hand you the rope they plan to hang themselves with." Bennett smiled a knowing expression. He understood the assignment perfectly. "We will be docile," Boss Bennett replied, gathering his briefcase. "We will collect every fabricated ledger they offer and validate their delusions until we walk out the door." I nodded, dismissing them. The trap was primed. 2 hours later, my squad stepped through the double doors of Harrison Properties. Through the audio link connected to Bennett's lapel microphone, I listened to the interaction live from my desk. The reception area maintained an illusion of extreme wealth, featuring imported marble floors and expensive modern art, but the underlying tension of unpaid vendors hung heavily in the air. Bradley and Trey kept my team waiting in the lobby for 45 minutes, a classic power play designed to establish dominance. When they emerged, their blinding arrogance was suffocating. Bradley approached with an exaggerated swagger, his gold watch catching the lobby lights. "Welcome to our empire," Bradley boasted, oblivious that his empire was residing on my execution block. Trey walked beside him, adjusting his silk tie. Trey took control of the narrative, treating my senior analysts like college interns. "Listen up, kids," Trey announced, his voice booming with authority. "We are busy men managing a complex operation. We will give you access to our data room, but I expect you to move fast. Do not get bogged down in minor details. The big picture is that we are immensely profitable, and this Vanguard capital injection is fuel for our expansion. Follow me and try to keep up." Bennett and his team followed them into the boardroom, playing their parts flawlessly. They sat with their posture hunched, nodding eagerly at every ridiculous statement Trey made. I listened as Trey slapped a thick stack of financial reports onto the glass table. "Here are the audited financials for the last 4 quarters, Trey declared proudly. "You will see a slight dip in liquid cash, but that is strategic reinvestment. Our tenant retention is phenomenal. Our asset valuation has skyrocketed 20% year over year." Bennett flipped slowly through the documents, his trained eyes instantly recognizing the blatant amateurish manipulation of the numbers. Through the audio feed, I heard Bennett use a carefully timed, hesitant tone. Sir Bennett asked softly, playing the intimidated clerk. "These projected revenue figures for the commercial plaza seem high given the market downturn. Are these verified?" Trey laughed loudly, a patronizing sound that echoed in the room. "Look, I know you guys are just reading from a standard Vanguard checklist," Trey mocked, leaning over the table to intimidate Bennett. "But I have forgotten more about commercial real estate than you will ever learn. I used to run a trading floor. I know how to aggressively forecast market trends. Those numbers are rock solid. You just need to trust the vision. You understand?" Bennett immediately backed down. "Of course, sir. We trust your expertise. We will just scan these files for the official record." While Trey continued to brag about his financial prowess, bragging about his plans to buy a massive yacht once the Vanguard funds cleared, my team went to work. They silently scanned every fraudulent document, every manipulated ledger, and every doctored tax return. They did not just take the physical copies. Using specialized extraction drives, they pulled the metadata directly from the Harrison Properties' internal servers. They harvested the digital footprints, proving Bradley and Trey had altered the revenue streams hours before the meeting. My team smiled, offered compliments, and praised Trey for his corporate strategy, all while siphoning the irrefutable proof of his federal crimes directly into my secure Vanguard database. The audacity of their performance was breathtaking. Trey patted one of my senior analysts on the back, offering him unsolicited, condescending career advice on how to be a real winner in the corporate world. My analyst simply smiled and thanked Trey for his profound wisdom. Every single fake number they proudly displayed was a nail driven deep into their own corporate coffin. I sat in my penthouse office watching the files upload. The massive volume of criminal negligence was staggering. Trey had handed my auditors the spreadsheets he used to embezzle company funds to cover his gambling debts, disguising them as consulting fees. Bradley had signed off on fake invoices to ghost companies to fund his car obsession. They truly thought they were brilliant. They thought they had conned the largest private equity firm in Chicago. They believed my auditors were blind to their deception. As Bennett and the team wrapped up the meeting, shaking hands with the men they were about to legally and completely destroy, Trey delivered one final arrogant remark. "Make sure you tell your bosses at Vanguard that we expect the wire transfer by Friday," Trey demanded. "We have important moves to make and we do not like waiting." Bennett replied with a respectful tone. "I will deliver these files to our senior partner immediately, sir. I am sure she will be fascinated by your submission." When the audio feed cut out, I leaned back in my chair and smiled. The illusion of their superiority was complete. They had walked into the slaughterhouse, locked the door behind them, and handed me the executioner's blade. I decided to personally visit the very scene of the crime. My auditors were wrapping up their charade inside Harrison Properties, and I needed to observe the dynamics firsthand. I threw a simple gray trench coat over my tailored suit, ensuring I looked like the mundane woman my family believed me to be. I parked exactly a block away from their glittering corporate high-rise. Walking through the revolving glass doors of the lobby, I carried a small cardboard box. My official excuse was retrieving misdirected personal mail from the reception desk. The lobby was an echoing cavern of imported marble and false prosperity. As I approached the counter, I heard the obnoxious laughter of my brother-in-law echoing near the elevators. Trey and Bradley were escorting my undercover audit team back down to the main floor. Bennett held his briefcase securely, playing the role of the thoroughly impressed junior clerk with absolute perfection. I kept my head lowered, pretending to sort through a stack of envelopes. I wanted to remain a fly on the wall, but destiny had a much more entertaining script in mind. The heavy brass doors of the executive elevator slid open, and my father strode out. Richard wore a bespoke navy pinstripe suit, projecting the false image of a highly successful real estate tycoon. His sharp eyes scanned the marble expanse, looking to greet the Vanguard representatives and secure his $80 million lifeline. Instead, his gaze locked directly onto me. The color drained from his face before a dark, violent shade of crimson flooded his cheeks. He completely ignored the approaching group and marched straight toward me, his expensive leather shoes echoing loudly against the stone floor. "What in the hell are you doing inside my building?" Richard hissed, stopping mere inches from my face. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble designed to intimidate me. "I explicitly told you that you were permanently banned from these premises." I looked up at him, maintaining a blank, unbothered expression. "I am simply retrieving my misrouted mail," I replied softly, holding up the envelopes. "I will be out of your way in a moment." Richard sneered, snatching the envelopes out of my hand and tossing them back onto the reception desk. "You do not belong here," he growled. "You are a stain on this family, and you are trespassing on private corporate property." Before he could summon building security to drag me out into the freezing snow, Trey and Bradley reached the center of the lobby, flanking my undercover audit team. Richard immediately spotted Bennett and the Vanguard analysts. My father possessed a toxic need to assert dominance. He saw an immediate opportunity to elevate his own status by publicly crushing mine. Richard straightened his posture, pasting a sickeningly charming smile onto his face as he turned toward the group. "Gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice loud and welcoming, "I hope my son and my son-in-law took excellent care of you. We are incredibly eager to finalize our partnership with Vanguard Holdings." Bennett offered a polite, deferential nod. "The data collection has been very illuminating, sir." Trey puffed out his chest, pointing a thumb in my direction. "Look who decided to crash the big leagues," Trey mocked. "Did you get lost on your way to the grocery store, Vivian?" Richard stepped beside me, placing a heavy, condescending hand on my shoulder. His grip was painfully tight. "Gentlemen, I apologize for the intrusion," Richard said to my employees, his voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "This is my estranged daughter, Vivian. She lacks the intellectual capacity for corporate finance, so we keep her far away from the boardroom. But since she is standing right here taking up space, we might as well make her useful." Richard looked down at me, his eyes cold and dead. "Run across the street to the premium cafe, Vivian. Get these important men whatever coffee they want. It is the only task you are actually qualified to handle in this building. Do not mess up the orders." The air in the lobby instantly froze. My forensic accounting team stood in paralyzed shock. They knew I possessed the sole authority to wipe Harrison Properties off the face of the earth with a single phone call. And here was a desperate, bankrupt man treating me like an unpaid errand girl. I shifted my gaze toward Bennett. The lead auditor's face was turning pale. He opened his mouth, his professional composure cracking. He was about to break his cover. He was a fraction of a second away from destroying my father right then and there, ready to announce that the woman they were humiliating was the senior partner holding their financial execution warrant. I could not let him ruin the grand finale. I locked eyes with Bennett. I offered him a microscopic shake of my head. With deliberate precision, I gave my lead auditor a slow, distinct wink. Bennett swallowed hard, his jaw snapping shut. He immediately understood the silent command. Stand down and play the game. I turned back to my father, masking my lethal amusement behind a veil of total submission. I offered a meek, defeated nod. Of course, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I would be happy to fetch the coffee. Please tell me your orders. Trey barked out a demand for a complicated espresso drink, while Bradley requested a black iced coffee. My employees, sweating profusely under the immense pressure of the charade, mumbled their simple requests. I memorized the list, turned around, and walked calmly toward the revolving glass doors. Every step I took away from that lobby was fueled by pure anticipation. They truly believed I was a broken, compliant failure. I stepped out into the biting Chicago wind, walking toward the cafe with a terrifying sense of peace. The trap was locked tight, and my arrogant family had absolutely no idea they were now drinking coffee bought by their ultimate executioner. I pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the Harrison Properties building, balancing a large cardboard carrier holding 6 steaming cups of premium coffee. The freezing Chicago wind whipped around my ankles before the heated imported air of the lobby completely enveloped me. I kept my posture deliberately submissive, my shoulders slightly hunched, playing the role of the obedient, defeated daughter to absolute perfection. My father Richard stood in the center of the expansive marble floor, deep in conversation with my brother Bradley. My brother-in-law Trey was currently lecturing my undercover Vanguard audit team about the aggressive expansion strategies he planned to implement once our capital injection arrived. As I approached the group, the atmosphere grew incredibly tense. Bennett, my lead forensic auditor, spotted me first. I could see the sheer terror flashing in his eyes. Here was his ultimate superior, the senior partner who commanded billions of dollars in assets, carrying a tray of lattes like a common intern. The Vanguard analysts shifted uncomfortably in their tailored suits, completely paralyzed by the bizarre dynamic playing out right in front of them. I lowered my gaze, refusing to make direct eye contact with my employees, completely committing to the humiliating performance. I walked straight toward the men offering the drink carrier with steady hands. My father snatched his black coffee without a single word of thanks, immediately turning his back to me, as if my mere presence offended him. Bradley took his iced beverage, flashing a cruel, mocking smile that highlighted his overwhelming arrogance. I then turned toward my Vanguard employees. When I handed Bennett his drink, I noticed his fingers were visibly trembling. He accepted the paper cup as if it were a fragile, explosive device, muttering a barely audible thank you. He was terrified that my family's staggering disrespect would somehow trigger a massive corporate bloodbath right there in the lobby. But I remained perfectly serene. I turned to face Trey. My brother-in-law stood tall, adjusting the cuffs of his expensive designer suit, looking down at me with unbridled disgust. I extended my hand, offering him the highly complicated, customized espresso drink he had so loudly demanded earlier. Trey grabbed the cup roughly from my grasp, his heavy gold rings clinking against the cardboard sleeve. He did not say thank you. He did not even look me in the eye. Instead, he brought the rim to his mouth and took a long, deliberate sip. For a fraction of a second, the lobby was completely silent. Then Trey contorted his face into a mask of pure, exaggerated revulsion. He violently spit the coffee back into the cup, coughing loudly for dramatic effect. He held the cup away from his body, as if it contained toxic poison. His dark eyes locked onto mine, burning with a vicious, toxic need to assert dominance in front of the Vanguard representatives. He wanted to prove that he was a powerful corporate titan and that I was nothing more than the family trash. Trey raised his arm and, with a swift, aggressive motion, slammed the nearly full cup of scalding coffee directly into the rim of a nearby polished brass trash can. The plastic lid popped off on impact. Brown liquid splashed violently across the immaculate marble floor, splattering against the base of the expensive receptacle and leaving a steaming, messy puddle right at my feet. "What is wrong with you?" Trey shouted, his voice echoing loudly across the cavernous lobby. "I explicitly asked for oat milk. This is standard dairy. You cannot even follow a basic simple instruction. My father turned around, shaking his head in profound disappointment while Bradley chuckled openly at my public humiliation. Trey stepped closer to me, using his height to physically intimidate me. You are completely useless, Vivian. This is exactly why your father banned you from the executive floor. You are a total failure. You have absolutely no skills, no ambition, and no value. We are conducting multi-million-dollar deals with top-tier financial institutions today, and you cannot even fetch a correct cup of coffee. You are a pathetic waste of space. Now clean up this disgusting mess before you slip and ruin these gentlemen's expensive shoes. My Vanguard auditors stood entirely frozen, their faces pale with shock. They were witnessing a man verbally abuse the single most powerful woman in Chicago private equity. Bennett looked like he was about to physically intervene, his professional restraint hanging by a thread. I shot him a sharp, covert glare, instantly silencing any heroic impulses. I did not flush with anger. I did not raise my voice or defend my dignity. I simply looked at the spilled coffee soaking into the imported marble. Without a single word of protest, I walked over to the lobby reception desk, grabbed a handful of paper napkins, and returned to the scene. I knelt down in my tailored gray coat, pressing the napkins into the dark puddle, wiping the floor clean, right at Trey's expensive leather shoes. The silence from the audit team was deafening. They were watching their ruthless, untouchable boss wipe the floor for a bankrupt, delusional fraudster. I gathered the soaked napkins, dropped them into the brass trash can, and slowly stood back up. I wiped my hands together, maintaining a completely blank expression. I looked directly at Trey, then at my father. I offered them a slow, deeply sarcastic, mocking bow. I hope your massive deal with Vanguard Holdings brings you exactly what you deserve, I whispered softly. I turned on my heel and walked out of the revolving doors into the freezing snow. My family thought they had successfully broken my spirit. They did not know that Trey's cruel, pathetic stunt had just permanently sealed their financial tomb. Every ounce of mercy I might have harbored was now entirely gone. I was going to obliterate them and their company without a single second of hesitation or regret whatsoever. I would destroy them all. The transition from the freezing Chicago street back to the towering glass fortress of Vanguard Holdings took exactly 15 minutes. I rode the private executive elevator up to the 50th floor, shedding the oversized gray trench coat that had served as my pathetic disguise. I handed the damp coat to Cameron without a single glance and walked directly into my corner office. The temperature up here was perfectly regulated, a sharp contrast to the bitter cold of the sidewalk and the freezing humiliation of the Harrison Properties lobby. I smoothed down my tailored suit, took my seat behind the massive mahogany desk, and waited. The trap was sprung, and now it was time to collect the bodies. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass door swung open. Bennett entered, followed closely by his two senior analysts. They looked entirely exhausted, their professional composure stretched to the absolute breaking point. Bennett placed a heavily encrypted hard drive and a thick stack of printed financial ledgers directly onto the center of my desk. He stood there for a moment, his jaw clenched, staring at me with a mixture of profound respect and lingering horror. He was clearly still processing the bizarre spectacle he had witnessed in the lobby, watching his billionaire boss wipe spilled coffee off the floor for a disgraced, arrogant fraudster. "Speak, Bennett," I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the office. "Give me the preliminary assessment of the target." Bennett swallowed hard, adjusting his tie before shifting fully back into his role as my lead forensic auditor. "Boss, I have to say your family is running a criminal syndicate disguised as a commercial real estate firm." Bennett began, his voice steadying as he tapped the hard drive. "They handed us the sanitized, doctored books just like you predicted." But while Trey was busy bragging about his imaginary yacht and lecturing us on market dominance, our extraction software bypassed their pathetic firewall. We pulled 10 years of raw, unedited financial data directly from their main servers. What we found goes way beyond simple gross negligence or standard corporate bankruptcy. They are bleeding the company dry through systemic embezzlement. "Show me," I ordered, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the polished wood. Bennett opened the first physical file and slid it toward me. Let us start with the current Chief Executive Officer. Your brother Bradley has been utilizing a highly illegal payroll diversion scheme for the past 14 months. He created 3 fictitious vendor accounts and disguised them as independent contracting firms. Whenever the company secured a small construction loan, Bradley routed 20% of the capital directly into these shell companies. I scanned the documents, my eyes catching the highlighted routing numbers. Where exactly did the diverted capital end up going? I asked, tracing the money trail with my pen. Directly into a private offshore account, Bennett replied, flipping to the next page. But he is incredibly sloppy. He did not let the money sit. 3 weeks ago, he authorized a massive wire transfer from that exact offshore account to a luxury European auto dealership. Bradley essentially stole employee payroll and delayed contractor payments to purchase a brand new, fully loaded Porsche 911 GT3 RS. He registered the vehicle under a holding company, but the signature on the purchase agreement matches his internal corporate authorizations perfectly. It is textbook wire fraud. I let out a low, cold laugh. My brother had always possessed a crippling need to project extreme wealth. He was driving a stolen supercar while his employees were likely facing delayed paychecks before the holidays. It was pathetically predictable. And what about my brother-in-law? I asked, shifting my gaze back to Bennett. What dark secrets is Trey hiding behind his cheap cologne and loud suits? Bennett's expression tightened into a grim line. Trey is a walking federal indictment waiting to happen. His financial crimes are actually much worse because they are incredibly desperate. We tracked his corporate credit card usage and cross-referenced it with his expense reports. Trey has been writing off massive cash withdrawals as client entertainment and high-level consulting fees. Over the last 8 months, he has siphoned nearly $600,000 out of the company's operating budget. I leaned back in my executive chair, genuinely surprised by the sheer volume of the theft. $600,000 in 8 months is impossible to hide in a failing mid-size firm, I noted. Where is the cash going? Las Vegas. Bennett stated flatly, sliding a thick stack of bank statements across my desk. Trey has a catastrophic gambling addiction. We tracked the wire transfers from the corporate accounts directly to 3 major casinos on the Vegas Strip. He has been taking private flights on Thursday nights, blowing hundreds of thousands of dollars at the high-limit baccarat tables and returning on Monday mornings, claiming he was on business trips. He is completely leveraged. He owes money to the casinos, and based on some intercepted emails from his personal account, he is also heavily indebted to some extremely dangerous private lenders. The silence in my office was deafening as the complete picture finally came into absolute focus. My family was not just struggling with a tough real estate market. They were not just facing a standard corporate bankruptcy. Harrison Properties was a hollowed-out shell actively being cannibalized by 2 incredibly greedy, morally bankrupt men who thought they were entirely invincible. The $80 million bailout they were begging Vanguard Holdings for was never intended to save the company. It was a desperate, illegal cash grab designed to pay off Trey's dangerous gambling debts and fund Bradley's absurd luxury lifestyle. They planned to take my firm's money, burn through it in a matter of months, and leave the ruins of the company to rot. And to secure this massive fraud, they had willfully forged my signature on the collateral documents for my grandfather's land. They are dead, I whispered softly, my eyes fixed on the damning evidence spread across my desk. They are walking corpses. Bennett nodded slowly. Boss, this is not a restructuring deal anymore. We are looking at massive federal crimes: wire fraud, bank fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement. If we hand this drive over to the authorities, the FBI will raid their headquarters by tomorrow morning. Both Bradley and Trey are looking at a minimum of 15 to 20 years in federal prison. I placed my hand firmly over the hard drive, feeling the cold metal casing. Do not contact the authorities yet, Bennett. I commanded, my voice carrying absolute lethal authority. I am not going to let the federal government take away my hard-earned prize. If the FBI raids them now, my family will simply play the victims. They will hire expensive defense attorneys, drag the process out for years, and hide behind the excuse of corporate ignorance. I want them to feel the exact moment their entire world shatters. I want them to stand in the very room where they thought they would become kings, only to realize they have been completely slaughtered. I dismissed my audit team, thanking them for their flawless execution. When I was finally alone in my office, I gathered the forged collateral agreement, the evidence of Bradley's stolen Porsche, and the undeniable proof of Trey's massive gambling debts. I placed them inside a sleek black leather portfolio. The Harrison family thought I was a pathetic, discarded woman who was only fit to fetch their coffee. They had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding the loaded gun directly to their heads. I was not just going to bankrupt them. I was going to utterly destroy their freedom, their marriages, and their lives. All the pieces were now in my hands. The execution was ready to begin. I was still staring at the damning evidence of my family's financial crimes when my personal cell phone broke the silence of my penthouse office. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. Catherine never called me during business hours. In fact, she rarely called me at all, unless she needed a favor or a scapegoat. I pressed the answer button, leaning back into the leather of my executive chair. Vivian Catherine began, her voice tight with that familiar elitist irritation she always reserved exclusively for me. I just received a very disturbing phone call from your father and Trey. I need to know what on earth possessed you to behave so erratically in the lobby of Harrison Properties today. I kept my voice completely flat. I was retrieving my mail. Richard ordered me to buy coffee for visiting executives. Trey threw his coffee at a trash can, missed, and demanded I clean it up. I cleaned it up. Which part of that sequence do you consider erratic? Do not use that insolent tone with me. Catherine snapped, her breathing hitching with manufactured outrage. Trey is under an immense amount of pressure. He is currently navigating a highly sensitive $80 million negotiation that will secure our family's wealth for the next century. He needs absolute respect and compliance from everyone. Instead, you showed up looking like a complete vagrant and deliberately embarrassed him in front of the Vanguard Holdings auditors. He said you were clumsy, spilled the coffee on purpose, and made him look bad. It was breathtaking how easily they twisted reality to victimize the abuser. He threw a scalding beverage at my feet. Mother, he is a senior executive, Catherine countered sharply, completely dismissing my reality. You are just a bitter woman holding a grudge because you do not have a seat at the table. Your sister is practically in tears because Trey came home completely stressed by your little stunt. We are about to enter a completely new tax bracket, Vivian. We cannot have you acting out of sheer jealousy. I let her words hang in the air, feeling absolutely nothing. No grief, no anger, just a clinical detachment. So why exactly are you calling me Catherine? I am calling to give you a chance to fix this, she demanded, her tone shifting into an authoritarian command. I want you to pick up the phone call, Trey, and offer him a profound, sincere apology. Tell him you are out of line. Tell him you respect his position in this family and his contribution to the company. If you do not apologize to him right now, your father and I are making a permanent decision. She paused for dramatic effect, weaponizing her maternal authority. If you do not fix this and beg for his forgiveness, we are cutting all ties. We will completely erase you from our lives. You will never attend another holiday, you will never step foot in our home, and as far as this family is concerned, you will be considered completely dead to us. The sheer audacity of her ultimatum was the ultimate catalyst. They wanted me to bow down to a criminal who was currently stealing from them, a man who was actively forging documents that would send them all to federal prison. They wanted me to beg for scraps of their toxic love to protect a man who was burning their money at blackjack tables. I looked down at the forged land deed on my desk. I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that reached my eyes. Fine, I said, my voice dropping to a glacial, unyielding whisper. Consider me dead. I ended the call. I immediately opened my phone settings and permanently blocked her number, followed by Richard, Bradley, Sloan, and Trey. The severance was absolute. There would be no more warnings, no more chances. They had officially severed the final microscopic thread of my familial mercy. I picked up my secure office line and dialed my aggressive acquisitions team. The time for passive observation was over. It was time to execute a lethal hostile takeover. My lead acquisitions director answered immediately. Boss, what is the target? Harrison Properties. I commanded my mind shifting entirely into corporate warfare mode. I want you to aggressively map out their entire external debt profile. I know they owe multiple secondary lenders, regional banks, and private credit lines. I do not just want to be their potential savior through this $80 million Vanguard deal. I want to become their absolute undeniable master. I pulled up the preliminary audit reports Bennett had just delivered. They have a $20 million commercial mortgage with a regional bank in Ohio. They owe $12 million to a private creditor in New York. They have several smaller unsecured loans scattered across the Midwest. I want you to initiate immediate, highly aggressive buyouts on every single piece of commercial paper attached to the Harrison name. That will require paying a slight premium to acquire the debt so quickly, the director noted, typing rapidly on his end. Secondary lenders will smell blood in the water. Pay the premium, I instructed ruthlessly. Use my discretionary capital fund. Buy up every single promissory note, every mortgage, every line of credit. Consolidate it all under a Vanguard shell corporation that reports directly to me. I want the entire transaction completed and legally bound within 48 hours. By executing this maneuver, I was rapidly transforming the corporate battlefield. Harrison Properties was already suffocating under massive liabilities. By purchasing all of their outstanding debt from external banks, I was consolidating their financial existence into a single localized point of failure. I was cutting off their ability to negotiate with multiple lenders or seek debt restructuring through separate channels. When the dust settled, Harrison Properties would owe every single dime of their existence to Vanguard Holdings. More specifically, they would owe it directly to me. We are initiating the debt purchase protocol right now, my director confirmed. We will swallow their entire liability portfolio by tomorrow evening. You will be their sole creditor. Excellent, I replied, staring out at the freezing Chicago night. Once we hold all their debt, we can trigger the acceleration clauses the second they breach a single financial covenant. And based on the forged documents sitting on my desk, they are already in massive default. I hung up the phone and locked the devastating evidence inside my personal office safe. Catherine thought she had delivered a punishing blow by declaring me dead to the family. She had no idea that by doing so, she had just handed me the absolute psychological freedom to destroy them without a shred of guilt. I was no longer a daughter, a sister, or an outcast. I was a supreme apex predator in the financial sector, and I had just purchased the legal right to completely annihilate their entire universe. The stage was perfectly set for the final bloody boardroom massacre. They wanted to play corporate games. I was about to show them how professionals win. The freezing Chicago wind howled through the concrete canyons of the financial district, but the Harrison family felt absolutely invincible. It was Friday morning, the designated execution day for the $80 million bailout. From my secure observation monitors on the 50th floor, I watched the live security feed as two black luxury SUVs pulled up to the curb outside the Vanguard Holdings tower. The valet staff rushed forward, but my family waved them off with aggressive, impatient gestures. They stepped out onto the pristine pavement, completely unbothered by the biting cold, entirely insulated by their monumental delusion. They were dressed for a coronation. My father Richard wore a brand new charcoal gray Brioni suit, his chest puffed out like a conquering general returning from a victorious campaign. My mother Catherine draped herself in a full-length mink coat, her neck heavy with diamonds that I knew for a fact had not been fully paid off. Bradley flanked his father aggressively, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt to ensure his recently stolen Porsche-funded Rolex was highly visible to anyone who walked past. Trailing right behind them, completely embodying the pinnacle of unearned arrogance, was Trey. My brother-in-law wore a violently loud, custom-tailored burgundy suit that screamed desperate new money. His African-American features were set in a mask of absolute untouchable superiority. Beside him, Sloane strutted in a tight designer dress, and towering heels, her designer handbag swinging from her forearm. They moved as a unified pack, marching through the towering revolving glass doors and stepping into the expansive, hushed, and intimidating lobby of Vanguard Holdings. They did not walk like people who were currently technically bankrupt. They walked like they had already purchased the entire skyscraper. The security feed captured every single humiliating detail of their arrival. Richard marched directly toward the main reception desk, completely bypassing the velvet ropes and the discreet queue of other corporate visitors. The chief receptionist, a highly trained professional who managed billionaires daily, offered a polite, practiced smile. Richard slammed his leather briefcase onto the polished marble counter. "We are the executive board of Harrison Properties," Richard announced, his voice booming across the quiet lobby, intentionally loud enough to ensure everyone nearby heard his self-importance. "We are here to finalize an $80 million acquisition deal. Inform your superior that Richard Harrison has arrived. We expect to be escorted to the executive boardroom immediately. Do not make us wait." The receptionist maintained her flawless composure, tapping quietly on her keyboard. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. I have your party registered. I will notify the 50th floor of your arrival. Please take the private express elevator on your left." Trey leaned heavily against the marble desk, snapping his fingers at a young administrative assistant who was walking past with a stack of files. "Hey, kid," Trey barked, pointing a heavy gold-ringed finger toward the elevators. "Grab my wife's coat and carry it up for her. We are about to inject a massive amount of capital into this firm, and I expect top-tier service from the ground floor up." The assistant blinked in total shock, completely unaccustomed to such blatant disrespect in a top-tier financial institution. Before the situation could escalate, the receptionist smoothly intervened, directing the family toward the VIP elevator bank with a tight, forced smile. Catherine scoffed loudly, adjusting her mink coat herself. "The service here is shockingly mediocre," Catherine complained to Sloane, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "When we finish signing this paperwork, I am going to insist that Vanguard upgrades their hospitality staff. They should know how to treat elite clientele." I watched them pile into the mirrored mahogany-paneled express elevator. As the heavy brass doors slid shut, sealing them inside a soundproof metal box rocketing toward the sky, I switched my monitor to the internal elevator camera. The audio feed clicked on, broadcasting their private, unfiltered conversation directly into my earpiece. The sheer level of financial delusion echoing inside that small space was absolutely staggering. They were completely euphoric, drowning in a toxic cocktail of greed and impending victory. Trey adjusted his burgundy tie in the elevator mirror, his white teeth flashing in a massive predatory grin. "The second the ink dries on that term sheet, I am wiring the deposit for the new yacht," Trey boasted, clapping Bradley hard on the shoulder. 75 feet of pure luxury. I already picked out the custom leather upholstery for the main deck. We are going to dock it right in Miami next winter. It is going to be spectacular. Bradley laughed, a loud, obnoxious sound. "I am upgrading the garage," Bradley added, staring lovingly at his stolen watch. "The Porsche is nice, but I want a Ferrari next. Maybe two. Since we are using Vanguard's money, we might as well expand the fleet." Sloane leaned against the back wall, inspecting her perfect manicure. "I am flying straight to Paris next week," Sloane declared. "I need a completely new wardrobe to match our new tax bracket. I cannot be seen wearing last season's collections now that we are officially partnering with a private equity titan." Catherine patted Sloane's arm approvingly. "Exactly, darling. We have survived that temporary cash flow annoyance. Today we secure our legacy. We are stepping into the true elite circle, and nobody can ever look down on the Harrison family again. Especially not after the garbage we had to deal with at Thanksgiving." Richard stood at the front of the elevator, watching the floor numbers rapidly climb higher and higher. "Just remember the strategy," Richard instructed, his voice thick with unearned authority. "Let me do the talking. Vanguard thinks they have us cornered with those collateral demands, but they are just hungry for our real estate portfolio. We sign the papers, we take the 80 million, and we run the board. They need us just as much as we need them. We hold the absolute power today." The elevator chimed a soft melodic note as it reached the 50th floor. The brass doors slid open smoothly, revealing the pristine, silent, and incredibly intimidating executive level of Vanguard Holdings. The thick plush carpets absorbed their footsteps as they stepped out of the elevator. The air up here was different, cold, sterile, and smelling faintly of expensive wood polish and high-stakes corporate warfare. My senior executive assistant Cameron stood perfectly straight at the end of the long hallway, waiting to guide them to their financial slaughter. The Harrison family walked down the corridor with their heads held high, their shoulders squared, completely intoxicated by their own fabricated reality. They thought they were walking into a coronation. They believed they were about to shake hands with a faceless corporate entity and walk out as untouchable kings. They had absolutely no idea that every single step they took on my floor was pulling them deeper and deeper into a lethal, inescapable trap. The hunt was over. The prey had willingly marched straight into the tiger's den. Now all that remained was to lock the cage and slowly turn on the lights. Cameron guided the Harrison family down the expansive corridor of the 50th floor. His professional demeanor was an impenetrable fortress, betraying none of the lethal traps hidden beneath this meeting. He stopped at the frosted glass doors guarding the premier executive boardroom. Cameron pushed the heavy glass open, revealing a breathtaking space designed for high-stakes corporate warfare. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the freezing Chicago skyline. A massive black walnut table dominated the room, flanked by 20 ergonomic leather chairs. The atmosphere was intimidating, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive espresso. My family, blinded by their monumental greed, did not sense the danger. They only saw the glittering reflection of their own wealth. Richard marched toward the head of the table, aggressively pulling out the dominant chair reserved for the managing partner. Before he could sit, Cameron intervened, gesturing to the opposite side of the walnut slab. "Please take a seat on the guest side, Mr. Harrison," Cameron instructed with firm authority. "The chairman's seat must remain vacant for the presiding partner." Richard scowled, visibly irritated, but he complied, adjusting his suit jacket as he sat down. Catherine took the seat next to him, running her manicured hands over the smooth leather while Bradley and Sloane settled in. Trey leaned back, draping his arm over the chair with an air of profound ownership. "Bring us a bottle of your best champagne," Trey demanded, snapping his fingers at a junior assistant distributing legal binders. "We are about to sign an $80 million deal and my throat is incredibly dry. We need to celebrate." The assistant glanced at Cameron, who offered a microscopic nod. Within minutes, a silver ice bucket containing vintage champagne and 5 crystal flutes was wheeled into the boardroom. The cork popped with a sharp crack that echoed off the glass walls. Trey eagerly grabbed the bottle, pouring generous servings for everyone at the table. He raised his glass, his dark eyes gleaming with intense arrogance. "To the dominance of Harrison Properties," Trey announced, his booming voice filling the room. "And to the massive yacht that is going to be sitting in Miami by next winter. We played the game, we took the risks, and now we own the board." Richard raised his glass, clinking it against Trey's with a heavy thud. "To legacy," Richard corrected his tone, dripping with self-importance. "We weathered the storm. We proved that the Harrison name commands absolute respect in the financial sector. Vanguard Holdings recognized our immense value, and today we solidify our empire for the next generation." Catherine took a delicate sip of her champagne, her diamond necklace sparkling under the recessed lighting. "It is truly a beautiful day," Catherine mused, her lips curling into a wicked, highly satisfied smile. "The only thing missing is the dramatic exit of our most massive disappointment. I wonder where Vivian is right now. Do you think she is standing in line at a local unemployment office?" Bradley let out a loud, obnoxious bark of laughter, slamming his hand against the walnut table. "She is probably updating her pathetic resume, begging for a junior accounting role at some strip mall tax firm," Bradley mocked, shaking his head. "You saw her in the lobby yesterday. She actually wiped the floor like a common janitor. She has absolutely zero dignity left. Cutting her off was the smartest financial decision this board ever made." Trey leaned forward, swirling the expensive champagne in his crystal flute. "I told you all she was dead weight," Trey bragged, basking in the glow of his fabricated victory. "Women like her are incredibly toxic to a growing enterprise. She brings nothing to the table but jealousy and a pathetic poverty mindset. She looked like absolute garbage yesterday. Did you see that cheap coat she was wearing? It was completely offensive. Harrison Properties is a premium brand and she was a walking, breathing liability." Sloane giggled, checking her reflection in her phone screen. "I actually feel a tiny bit sorry for her." Sloane lied, her tone dripping with venomous sarcasm. "Imagine being 34, totally broke, disowned by your wealthy family, and completely alone. She has to live with the fact that she will never see a single dime of this $80 million Vanguard money. She is completely erased from our history." Bradley raised his glass again, his face flushed with champagne and unearned power. "Let us be entirely honest," Bradley declared loudly, looking at his father. "Banishing Vivian from the company was the best thing that ever happened to this family. We severed the diseased limb, and now the rest of the body is going to thrive. To a future without Vivian." They all raised their glasses, the crystal chiming together in a sickening symphony of cruelty and delusion. They drank to my absolute destruction, completely unaware that their own execution was already scheduled and currently ticking down to zero. Suddenly, the low murmur of the central air conditioning system seemed to hum louder. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom darkened as a tall, imposing silhouette appeared in the hallway outside. The heavy, rhythmic sound of confident footsteps approached the entrance, echoing sharply against the marble floor. The laughter inside the boardroom died instantly. Richard lowered his champagne flute, his spine stiffening as he prepared to greet the Vanguard executive who held his financial destiny. Trey sat up straight, aggressively, adjusting his burgundy tie. Catherine smoothed her mink coat, placing a perfect, welcoming smile onto her face. The polished brass handle of the boardroom door turned slowly, emitting a heavy, deliberate, and highly metallic click that commanded the attention of every person present. An absolute terrifying and deeply suffocating silence descended upon the expansive room. The air inside grew instantly cold, completely shattering the warm, fragile illusion of their premature celebration. The heavy glass door began to swing open, and the shadowy figure finally stepped into the blinding, unforgiving fluorescent light of the room. The heavy frosted glass doors glided open with a quiet hiss of highly engineered pneumatic hinges. I stepped across the threshold, leaving the shadow of the corridor and entering the blinding panoramic light of the 50th floor executive boardroom. I was no longer wearing the oversized drab gray trench coat from the lobby. I was dressed for a corporate execution. I wore a razor-sharp, custom-tailored midnight black Tom Ford power suit. The cut was immaculate, designed to project absolute, uncompromising authority in male-dominated spaces. My heels struck the polished hardwood floor with a rhythmic, deafening crack that instantly shattered the quiet hum of their premature celebration. In my right hand, I carried a single thick, blood-red leather folder containing the total annihilation of Harrison Properties. I did not look at the guest side of the walnut table. I kept my chin elevated, my gaze locked dead ahead toward the vacant chairman's seat at the head of the room. The immediate physical reaction from my family was a masterpiece of ignorant entitlement. The crystal champagne flute in my father's hand actually trembled, spilling a few drops of vintage alcohol onto the expensive table. Richard's face rapidly transitioned from a mask of confident triumph to a violently dark shade of purple. He genuinely believed his discarded failure of a daughter had somehow bypassed building security to sabotage the most important financial moment of his entire life. Before Richard could even articulate his boiling rage, Trey violently shoved his ergonomic chair backward. The heavy leather seat slammed into the glass wall behind him. Trey stood up, his tall frame looming over the table, his face twisted in absolute unhinged fury. "What in the hell are you doing in here?" Trey roared, pointing his heavy gold-ringed finger directly at my chest. His voice was completely out of control, echoing aggressively against the glass walls. "Are you completely insane, Vivian?" I told you to stay away from us. Where's the building security? We need guards in here right now. Throw this pathetic woman out onto the street before the Vanguard executives arrive. Sloane gasped, clutching her designer handbag against her chest, as if my mere presence might infect her with poverty. You are psychotic, Vivian. Sloane shrieked, her voice shrill and echoing Trey's panic. You tracked us down just to ruin our $80 million deal. You are obsessed with us. Catherine slammed her hands on the table, her diamond bracelets clattering loudly. Richard, do something, Catherine demanded, her eyes wide with manufactured terror. Get her out of this room before she destroys our legacy. She is completely out of her mind. Richard finally found his voice. He stood up, leaning his heavy fists against the walnut wood, his eyes burning with a toxic, lethal hatred. Vivian. I warned you. Richard growled, his voice a low, vibrating threat. I banned you from our lives. If you do not turn around and walk out that door this exact second, I swear to God I will have you arrested for corporate trespassing and harassment. You are nothing to us. You are a complete embarrassment. Leave immediately. I did not flinch. I did not stop walking. I simply reached the head of the massive table and turned to face them. I stood perfectly still, offering them a blank, utterly terrifying stare. The absolute silence of my response deeply unsettled them. Trey opened his mouth to scream another threat, but the words died instantly in his throat. Through the open boardroom doors behind me, a synchronized procession of highly intimidating figures marched into the room. Bennett, my lead forensic auditor, stepped in first, carrying his heavy briefcase. Behind him came my aggressive acquisitions director, the chief legal counsel for Vanguard Holdings, and Cameron, my senior executive assistant. 6 of the most ruthless, highly paid financial predators in Chicago filed into the boardroom, completely ignoring the screaming Harrison family. They moved with military precision, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of corporate power directly behind me. Cameron stepped briskly forward, completely ignoring my father's furious purple face. He reached out and smoothly pulled back the heavy leather chairman chair at the head of the table. Please have a seat, boss. Cameron said, his voice carrying the utmost professional reverence. I slowly sat down in the dominant chair, placing the blood-red folder directly onto the center of the walnut table. I folded my hands together, resting them on top of the leather cover. The entire Vanguard executive team remained standing behind me. In perfect, terrifying unison, these powerful men and women offered a crisp, deeply respectful bow toward my chair. Good morning, boss, the chief legal counsel announced, his voice slicing through the boardroom like a razor blade. The $80 million disbursement files are fully prepared and await your final authorization exactly as you ordered. The oxygen was instantly sucked out of the room. The Harrison family was struck by a devastating, paralyzing force of absolute reality. Trey froze, his arms still suspended in the air, where he had been aggressively pointing at me, his jaw dropping open in sheer, unadulterated horror. The deep burgundy color drained rapidly from his face, leaving behind a sickening ashen gray. Sloane's manicured hands began to shake violently, her designer handbag slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor with a dull thud. My mother, Catherine, let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, collapsing backward into her leather chair as if all the bones in her body had suddenly evaporated. Bradley stared at me, his eyes wide and completely unblinking, his brain entirely unable to process the apocalyptic scene unfolding right in front of his eyes. The woman they had humiliated, the sister they had endlessly mocked, the daughter they had violently discarded, was not a pathetic failure. She was the apex predator they had been begging for survival. But the most beautiful, deeply satisfying reaction belonged entirely to my father. Richard collapsed heavily into his chair, clutching the edge of the walnut table as if the entire skyscraper was collapsing around him. The extreme arrogance that had defined his entire miserable existence vanished in a single devastating heartbeat. He stared at the team of elite executives standing respectfully behind my chair, and then his terrified eyes locked onto mine. He finally realized the absolute fatal magnitude of his catastrophic mistake. He was sitting in my building, he was begging for my money, and he was completely, utterly dead. I settled deeply into the plush leather of the chairman's seat. The ergonomic chair molded perfectly to my posture, grounding me in the absolute center of corporate power. Across the massive black walnut table, the 5 people who had tormented me for my entire existence sat completely paralyzed. They looked like statues molded from pure terror. The blood had entirely evacuated their faces, leaving behind a sickly, translucent pallor that made them look like ghosts trapped under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom. I rested my elbows on the polished wood and intertwined my fingers, placing my hands deliberately over the blood-red leather folder. The silence in the room was so profound, so intensely heavy, that I could actually hear the ragged, uneven sound of my father trying to draw breath into his lungs. Richard stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His jaw hung slightly slack, completely stripped of the booming, authoritative voice he used to command his fragile empire. Beside him, Catherine looked as though she had been physically struck. Her manicured hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles had turned a stark bone white. Bradley was completely frozen, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the elite Vanguard executives standing stoically behind my chair, desperately trying to find a logical explanation for an impossible reality. And Trey, the man who had gleefully poured scalding coffee at my feet less than 24 hours ago, was currently visibly shaking. His dark skin had taken on a grayish hue, and his broad shoulders were hunched defensively, as if he expected the ceiling to collapse directly onto his head. I allowed the suffocating silence to stretch out for a full 60 seconds. I wanted them to marinate in their overwhelming confusion and mounting dread. I wanted the reality of their complete subordination to fully saturate their arrogant minds. When I finally spoke, my voice was a soft, glacial whisper that carried effortlessly across the expansive room. I believe we have some highly important business to discuss today. I began keeping my gaze locked with my father. But before we address the financial details of your pending bailout, I want to revisit a very specific conversation we had during Thanksgiving dinner. Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his expensive silk tie. "Vivian," he croaked, his voice cracking horribly. "Vivian, what is the meaning of this? How are you sitting in that chair?" I did not answer his pathetic question. I simply continued my measured, lethal monologue. "You explicitly stated that I was not qualified to work at Harrison Properties," I said, projecting each word with absolute surgical precision. "You told the entire family that you would be terrified to even let me pour the coffee for fear that I would somehow ruin it. You confidently declared that I lack the basic intellectual capacity for corporate finance and that I have absolutely no understanding of how real wealth operates." Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, casting a panicked glance at Trey. Trey refused to look at me, keeping his eyes glued to the polished surface of the table, his earlier bravado completely eradicated by the presence of my legal and financial team. "You officially banned me from your building." I continued, my voice remaining perfectly even and entirely devoid of mercy. "You called me a pathetic spinster, a total failure, and a walking, breathing liability to your premium brand. You demanded that I learn my place in this family. Well, Richard, I have learned my place. My place is right here, sitting at the head of the largest private equity firm in the Midwest, looking down at a group of desperate, bankrupt beggars." Catherine let out a whimpering sound, pressing her trembling fingers against her lips. "Vivian, please." Catherine begged, her voice high and thin. "There has been a massive misunderstanding. We did not know. We had no idea you were a senior partner here." I ignored her pathetic plea entirely. I unclasped my hands and slowly opened the blood-red leather folder resting in front of me. Inside sat the pristine, finalized $80 million capital injection contract. It was printed on heavy, high-quality parchment paper, bound with a thick silver clip. The document represented the absolute survival of the Harrison family. It was the money that was supposed to buy Trey his massive luxury yacht. It was the funding that was supposed to secure Bradley his new fleet of exotic sports cars. It was the financial lifeline that would allow Catherine to keep her country club membership and permit Sloane to go on her ridiculous Parisian shopping sprees. I slid my perfectly manicured index finger down the side of the thick stack of paper. "You came here today to secure your $80 million lifeline," I announced, watching their desperate eyes track my every movement. "You submitted your term sheets, you offered your collateral, and you genuinely believed that Vanguard Holdings was going to blindly wire you the cash to fund your absurd, fraudulent lifestyles. You walked into my lobby today acting like conquering kings." I picked up the heavy stack of contracts. I held the $80 million agreement up in the air, allowing the harsh boardroom lights to illuminate the dense legal text. Richard leaned forward instinctively, his eyes locked onto the document with sheer, unadulterated desperation. It was his entire legacy, his complete salvation, resting lightly in the hands of the daughter he had violently discarded. "You said I was not qualified to work for you?" I stated, my voice dropping an octave, carrying a terrifying absolute finality. With a slow, deliberate, and incredibly violent motion, I grasped the thick stack of papers with both hands. I twisted my wrists in opposite directions. The sound of the heavy parchment tearing echoed through the silent boardroom like a gunshot. I ripped the $80 million contract completely in half. Sloane let out a loud, piercing scream. Richard gasped violently, clutching his chest as if I had physically stabbed him. Bradley jumped out of his chair, his hands hovering over the table in a gesture of pure, helpless panic. "No," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "No, you cannot do that. That is our money." I let the torn halves of the contract flutter from my hands. They drifted down like dead leaves, landing haphazardly across the polished black walnut table. "You are absolutely right, Richard," I said, looking directly into my father's horrified wide eyes. "I am completely unqualified to work at Harrison Properties, because my exact professional qualification is to aggressively acquire and ruthlessly liquidate your pathetic garbage company." The air was entirely sucked out of the room. I sat perfectly still, a cold, predatory smile finally breaking across my face. I watched the realization wash over them in a tidal wave of absolute despair. They were not getting a single dime. They were not getting a bailout. They had willingly walked into my boardroom, and I had just locked the doors and set their entire financial universe on fire. There was no escape, no negotiation, and absolutely no mercy left to give. I reached across the table and picked up a silver remote next to my microphone. I pressed a single button. The motorized blackout blinds descended over the windows, plunging the boardroom into a tense twilight. A massive digital screen spanning the wall behind me hummed to life, casting a cold blue glow over the horrified faces of my family. "You came here today under the delusion that Harrison Properties was merely suffering from a temporary liquidity crisis," I announced, my voice cutting through the darkness. "You convinced yourselves the market downturn was the reason your empire was crumbling. But Vanguard Holdings does not write $80 million checks based on arrogant promises. We rely on forensic data. And your data tells a highly criminal story." I clicked the remote. The screen flashed, displaying an undeniable web of wire transfers, offshore bank routing numbers, and internal corporate ledgers. Bradley flinched visibly, his hands gripping the armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. I focused my gaze on my older brother. "Let us begin with our brilliant chief executive officer," I stated, allowing the mockery to drip from every word. "Bradley, you took over claiming you would modernize our portfolio. Instead, you instituted a massive payroll diversion scheme." The screen transitioned to show 3 distinct vendor contracts. "You created 3 fictitious consulting firms. Every time Harrison Properties secured a construction loan, you routed 20% of that capital directly into these shell companies, actively starving your legitimate contractors." Richard turned his head slowly, staring at his golden boy with a look of dawning horror. "Bradley, what is she talking about?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and panic. "Tell me this is a fabricated lie." Bradley opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a trapped animal, his arrogant swagger eradicated by the glaring proof of his felonies. I pressed the remote again. The screen illuminated an international wire transfer receipt alongside a photograph of a gleaming new Porsche. You funneled stolen corporate capital into a private offshore account. I continued twisting the knife. And just 3 weeks ago, while your employees faced delayed paychecks, you authorized a direct transfer to a European auto dealership to purchase this exact vehicle. You committed textbook wire fraud to fund your sports car obsession. Catherine let out a sharp gasp. Richard slammed his fist onto the table, his face contorting with fury. You stole from our own company, Richard roared, his voice cracking under the immense weight of the betrayal. You stole from me to buy a car while we faced federal bankruptcy. Before Bradley could formulate an excuse, I shifted my lethal attention directly toward my brother-in-law. Do not exhaust your anger just yet, Richard, I advised coldly. We still need to discuss the spectacular financial maneuvers of the man who claimed he was saving this empire. I clicked the remote. The screen shifted rapidly. A barrage of expense reports, massive cash withdrawal receipts, and security photographs filled the digital display. Trey physically recoiled in his chair, his dark skin turning a sickly shade of gray. His eyes widened in pure terror as he stared at the visual evidence. Trey, you proudly boasted about working massive overtime to secure high-level connections, I said, leaning forward to pierce his fragile ego. But our forensic extraction software revealed your true corporate strategy. You have been siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from the operating budget and disguising them as client entertainment and consulting fees. The screen zoomed in on a clear photograph of Trey sitting at a high-limit baccarat table inside a Las Vegas casino, a massive stack of chips sitting in front of him. You have been using company funds to feed a catastrophic gambling addiction. You burned through $600,000 of corporate cash in just 8 months. Trey shook his head frantically, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of denial. Sloan, baby, do not look at that. Trey pleaded, his voice high and panicked. It is fabricated. She is editing these photos to ruin me. I was conducting legitimate business out there. I swear to God. I smiled, a predatory expression devoid of any human mercy. I clicked the remote one final time. The display shifted to show itemized receipts from a luxury hotel on the Vegas Strip, alongside security footage of Trey entering a private elevator. He was not alone. Hanging off his arm was a young blonde woman wearing a tight designer dress and a diamond necklace that perfectly matched an invoice I projected right next to the footage. I do not think purchasing a $30,000 diamond necklace and charging 72 hours of expensive room service for your secret mistress counts as legitimate corporate business, Trey, I noted calmly. The silence that followed was violently heavy. Sloane stared at the screen, her manicured facade fracturing into jagged pieces. Her chest heaved rapidly as she processed the ultimate humiliation. Her husband was not just a bankrupt fraudster. He was actively financing his infidelity using stolen money while she paraded him around as her wealthy provider. Sloane let out a piercing shriek that shattered the quiet boardroom. She lunged across the leather chair, her hands curling into tight fists. She slapped Trey across the face with such vicious force that the sharp crack echoed violently against the glass walls. You disgusting, pathetic liar, Sloane screamed, losing her mind. You used my father's money to buy diamonds for a cheap Vegas escort. I will kill you. Trey raised his arms, trying to shield his face as Sloane continued to strike him wildly. Catherine grabbed Sloane's arm, sobbing uncontrollably, begging her younger daughter to stop causing a scene. Richard buried his face in his hands, completely broken, muttering incomprehensible words of despair as he watched his golden son and his arrogant son-in-law legally self-destruct. The flawless image of the Harrison family was totally annihilated. They were tearing each other apart like starving animals in the middle of my boardroom. I sat back in the chairman's seat, watching their demise with perfect serenity. The chaotic spectacle of Sloane attacking Trey eventually lost its momentum, replaced by the pathetic sounds of heavy panting and muffled weeping echoing in the boardroom. My father slowly lifted his face from his hands. The sheer magnitude of his financial ruin had finally penetrated his thick skull. Richard possessed the ruthless survival instincts of a cornered rat. He looked at the shattered remains of his golden boy and his disgraced son-in-law, calculating his only remaining path to absolute salvation. He straightened his ruined posture, smoothing the wrinkled lapels of his custom suit with violently trembling fingers. He turned his eyes toward me, attempting to summon a mask of paternal warmth that looked entirely grotesque on his pale face. "Vivian, my dear daughter." Richard began, his voice dripping with a sickening affection. "I am completely appalled. I had absolutely no idea these two reckless imbeciles were destroying the foundation of our family business behind my back. You have to believe me. You are a brilliant, capable woman. You possess the exact ruthless intellect that Harrison Properties desperately needs right now. We can fix this together. I will terminate Bradley and Trey immediately. I will have security physically escort them out of the building today. I will appoint you as Chief Executive Officer. You can take full control of the entire corporate portfolio. We can rebuild our empire together." I rested my chin on my intertwined fingers, observing his pathetic attempt at manipulation with absolute clinical detachment. "You are offering me the captain's seat on a sinking ship that is currently resting at the dark bottom of the ocean, Richard?" I replied, my voice slicing effortlessly through his desperate delusion. "You genuinely believe that handing me a bankrupt, hollowed-out shell of a company is some sort of grand prize? I do not want your worthless title. I do not want to sit in your decaying office. You seem to entirely misunderstand the fundamental power dynamic occurring in this boardroom today. I am not here to negotiate a heartwarming family reunion or accept a desperate, meaningless promotion. I am here to execute a flawless financial slaughter." I picked up the silver remote and pressed the button one more time. The massive digital screen behind me flickered, erasing the humiliating, incriminating photographs of Trey and Bradley. A brand new document illuminated the darkened room, projecting a crystal-clear, highly magnified image of a legally binding contract. Bradley let out a choked, terrified gasp, staggering backward until his spine hit the cold glass wall of the boardroom. Trey stopped rubbing his bruised cheek and stared at the glowing screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Projected in high definition was the collateral pledge agreement for the pristine commercial land my grandfather had explicitly placed into my private trust. The camera zoomed in aggressively on the bottom right corner of the final page, highlighting the dark blue ink of my own signature. Or rather, the clumsy, desperate forgery of my signature that Bradley had personally executed. "You both assumed I was an ignorant, disconnected spinster who would never monitor her own trust fund," I announced, stepping out from behind the heavy black walnut table. "You believed you could successfully bribe a corrupt notary, public fabricate a power of attorney, and leverage my grandfather's prime real estate to secure an $80 million loan from my own firm. You thought you were displaying absolute corporate brilliance." I walked slowly toward Bradley, my heels clicking sharply against the floor. "Instead, you handed me the ultimate execution weapon. This specific document elevates your pathetic corporate embezzlement directly into the realm of federal jurisdiction. Financial fraud, wire fraud, and forging a signature for federal financial gain. The mandatory minimum penalty for this level of highly documented premeditated bank fraud is 15 years in federal prison." Catherine let out a piercing wail, covering her face with her mink-sleeved arms, as the reality of federal prison sentences shattered her illusions. Richard stared at the forged signature, his jaw working silently as he realized the legal checkmate I had flawlessly engineered. But I was not finished. The criminal indictment was merely the appetizer. The true devastation lay in the financial checkmate. I turned back to the walnut table and picked up a massive, heavy stack of consolidated legal files. I raised the thick bundle of papers into the air before slamming them down onto the polished wood with a thunderous crash. "This is not just a Vanguard Holdings rejected bailout application," I declared, my voice echoing with supreme authority. "This is a complete record of a hostile debt acquisition. Yesterday evening, I authorized my acquisitions team to execute a massive sweep of your entire external liability portfolio." We paid a premium to every single secondary lender, regional bank, and private creditor you owe money to. I purchased your $20 million commercial mortgage in Ohio. I bought your $12 million private credit line in New York. I swallowed every piece of unsecured debt attached to the Harrison name. I leaned heavily over the table, bringing my face close to my father's terrified, sweating complexion. I do not just hold the evidence to send your son and your son-in-law to a federal penitentiary. I whispered my words, striking him like physical blows. I am now your sole undisputed creditor. I own every single dollar of your miserable existence because you breached multiple financial covenants the second you submitted those fraudulent documents. I have triggered the immediate acceleration clauses on all your consolidated loans. You owe Vanguard Holdings the entire balance payable immediately, and since you cannot pay, I hold the absolute legal right to foreclose on every single asset you possess. I own your commercial plazas. I own the corporate headquarters. I own your luxury vehicles. I paused, letting my cold gaze sweep over my mother's trembling form. And most importantly, I hold the absolute foreclosure rights to your primary residence. I am legally seizing the family mansion. You are completely eradicated. The absolute finality of my declaration hung in the freezing air of the boardroom for a fraction of a second before the entire room violently erupted. The psychological pressure of losing their wealth, their freedom, and their social status simultaneously acted as a catastrophic, explosive device. The carefully maintained illusion of the wealthy, united Harrison family shattered into a million jagged pieces right in front of my eyes. Trey was the first to completely snap. The profound humiliation of being exposed as a broke, desperate fraudster in front of elite financial executives completely short-circuited his arrogant mind. His dark eyes went wide with a rabid, feral intensity. He let out a guttural, furious roar that tore through his throat. He aggressively shoved his heavy leather chair backward with such violent force that it tipped over and crashed loudly onto the polished hardwood floor. "You manipulative little witch!" Trey screamed, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unhinged malice. "You set us up. I am going to tear you apart." He lunged across the massive black walnut table, his large hands reaching directly for my throat. He intended to use brute physical force to intimidate me, to physically punish the woman who had just legally executed him. But he severely underestimated the fortress I had built around myself. I did not even flinch or raise a single hand to defend my face. I remained perfectly still, leaning back into the luxurious leather of my chairman's seat. Before Trey could even cross the center of the massive boardroom table, two towering Vanguard security operatives materialized from the shadows near the entrance. These were not standard building guards. They were highly trained private security contractors who handled hostile corporate environments. They moved with terrifying, lethal speed. The first operative grabbed Trey by the collar of his custom burgundy suit and violently yanked him backward mid-lunge. The second operative swept Trey's legs out from under him. Trey hit the hardwood floor with a sickening, heavy thud. In the blink of an eye, the guards had Trey completely pinned face down against the cold ground. One operative pressed a heavy knee firmly between Trey's shoulder blades while twisting his right arm up behind his back in a painful submission hold. Trey thrashed wildly against the floor, kicking his expensive leather shoes and screaming profanities, but the guards held him down with effortless, crushing force. "Do not move a single muscle, sir," the operative commanded, his voice entirely devoid of any emotion. "If you attempt to assault the senior partner again, we will break your arm." Trey gasped for air. His cheek pressed hard against the polished wood, his aggressive swagger completely neutralized by overwhelming physical dominance. "Let me go," Trey yelled, his voice muffled against the floor. "She framed us. She fabricated those documents." The sight of Trey being physically subdued acted as a brutal catalyst for the rest of the family. The realization that they possessed absolutely no power, no leverage, and no physical dominance stripped away their remaining sanity. They immediately turned on each other like starving, cornered animals thrown into a fighting pit. Bradley saw his brother-in-law pinned to the floor and instantly recognized a desperate opportunity to save his own skin. The golden boy of the Harrison family possessed zero loyalty. Bradley frantically scrambled away from the table, pointing a shaking finger directly at Trey. It was his idea. Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. The forged signature was entirely his mastermind plan. Trey found the corrupt notary. Trey forced me to sign the paperwork. He told me it was the only way to secure the Vanguard capital. I did not want to do it, Vivian. You have to believe me. He threatened me. Trey twisted his head violently, trying to glare at Bradley from the floor. You cowardly, pathetic liar, Trey roared, struggling fruitlessly against the security guard holding his arm. You forged her name perfectly because you practice it. You embezzled the employee payroll to buy that stupid sports car. You are the CEO, Bradley. You signed every single fraudulent tax return. Do not try to pin your garbage leadership on me. I only took what I was owed. Sloane stood over her husband, her face a twisted portrait of absolute disgust and rage. She kicked the sole of Trey's shoe with her high heel. You stole my father's money to buy diamonds for a cheap escort in Vegas. Sloane shrieked, her voice echoing terribly off the glass walls. You ruined my life. I am filing for divorce this afternoon. You are a broke, pathetic criminal, and I hope you rot in federal prison for the rest of your miserable life. Bradley turned to me, his eyes wide with a sickening, desperate plea. Vivian, please, Bradley begged, clasping his hands together like a praying child. You can take the commercial properties. Take the entire company portfolio. Just tell the FBI that Trey acted alone. Let me walk away from this. I am your brother. You cannot send me to a federal penitentiary. I would not survive a week in there. I will testify against him in court. I will give you everything you need to lock him away forever. Just spare me. They were offering each other up for slaughter without a single second of hesitation. The supposed unbreakable bond of the Harrison family was nothing more than a fragile transaction based entirely on shared greed. The moment the money evaporated, their loyalty instantly dissolved into toxic venom. Then the most pathetic spectacle of the entire morning unfolded. My mother, Catherine, the woman who had spent 34 years mocking my appearance, my career, and my existence, completely lost her mind. The impending reality of losing her sprawling mansion, her country club status, and her expensive mink coats finally broke her fragile psyche. Catherine let out a loud, agonizing wail that sounded like a dying animal. She slid out of her leather chair and collapsed entirely onto the floor. She crawled on her hands and knees across the expensive boardroom rug, moving directly toward my chair. Her heavy diamond necklace swung wildly against her chest. Tears streamed down her face, completely ruining her pristine, expensive makeup. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, stripped of every ounce of her arrogant, elitist dignity. Vivian, my beautiful, brilliant daughter. Catherine sobbed heavily, grasping desperately at the hem of my custom-tailored trousers. Please, Vivian, I am begging you on my hands and knees. You cannot take our home. You cannot throw us out into the street. We will be absolutely ruined. My friends at the club will laugh at me. The public humiliation will literally kill me. Catherine wept uncontrollably, her manicured fingers clawing at my pant leg. It was all Richard, she cried, throwing her own husband under the bus with breathtaking speed. Richard pushed you away. Richard banned you from the company. I always told him he was making a terrible mistake. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. Please, Vivian, have mercy on your mother. Or I will do whatever you want. I will make Richard publicly apologize to you. I will disown Bradley and Sloane. Just please do not foreclose on the family estate. I cannot be homeless. I cannot be poor. I sat perfectly still in my dominant chair, looking down at the chaotic, miserable ruin of my bloodline. My brother was aggressively selling out his brother-in-law to avoid prison. My sister was screaming divorce threats at a man pinned to the floor by my private security. My mother was crawling at my feet, offering to abandon her other children just to save her luxurious mansion. My father sat paralyzed in his chair, silently watching his entire universe burn to the absolute ground. They had completely destroyed themselves, and I had not even raised my voice. This was the dark, beautiful symphony of their absolute destruction, and I was enjoying every single note. I looked down at the pathetic display unfolding across my expensive boardroom rug. My mother was still clutching the fabric of my trousers, her tears staining the immaculate material. My brother was sobbing into his hands, entirely consumed by the terrifying prospect of a federal prison sentence. My sister was gasping for air, her entire false reality fractured beyond repair. And my father remained completely frozen in his chair, a hollow, defeated shell of the tyrant who had ruled my childhood. My heart beat with a slow, steady, and terrifyingly calm rhythm. I pulled my leg back, forcing Catherine to release her frantic grip. I stood up from the heavy chairman's seat, rising to my full height. The movement commanded absolute silence. Even Trey, still pinned securely to the hardwood floor by my private security operatives, stopped his frantic struggling. Every eye in the room locked onto me wide with raw, primal desperation. They were waiting for a lifeline, a sliver of familial mercy, a hint that this was merely a harsh lesson, and not an actual execution. They were catastrophically wrong. "Get up off the floor, Catherine," I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy air like a sharpened blade. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this institution. You do not get to beg for mercy now. For 34 years you stood by and actively participated in my emotional destruction. You happily spent the money my father made while he ruthlessly stripped away my dignity. You enjoyed the luxury of looking down on me. Now you get to experience the exact poverty you constantly mocked." Catherine scrambled backward, pulling herself up against the edge of the black walnut table. She covered her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the room, finally understanding her tears possessed absolutely no currency here. I turned my sharp gaze toward my brother. "Bradley, you offered to testify against your own brother-in-law to save your skin. You are a coward. You routed employee payroll into your private offshore accounts to fund your pathetic sports car obsession. You do not get to negotiate a plea deal with me. I am not a federal prosecutor. I am your executioner. Your complete lack of loyalty is exactly why Harrison Properties bled to death under your leadership." Bradley buried his face in his arms, letting out an agonizing groan. His fate was sealed. Next, I looked down at Trey. His cheek remained pressed against the floor, the heavy knee of my security operative keeping him immobilized. "Trey," I stated, my voice dropping to a glacial octave, "you believed you were the smartest man in the room. You thought you could bypass the rules, forge my signature, and gamble away hundreds of thousands of dollars without a single consequence. You threw a cup of scalding coffee at my feet yesterday and demanded I clean it up. Now you are literally pinned to the floor of my empire, facing a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. I hope you remember this exact moment every single day you spend inside a concrete cell." Finally, my eyes locked onto my father. Richard had not spoken a word since I tore the $80 million contract in half. He simply stared at me, his face a terrifying shade of ashen gray. "Richard," I said softly, ensuring the devastating impact of my words reached the very core of his shattered ego. "You built a company on arrogance and debt. You banned me from your business because you feared my competence. Family is supposed to protect each other. You are not my family. You are simply a group of toxic, greedy individuals who happen to share a fraction of my genetic code and who foolishly attempted to steal my private assets." I walked slowly around the boardroom table, my heels clicking methodically against the floorboards. I stopped directly in front of the frosted glass doors. I turned back to face the miserable, broken ruins of the Harrison dynasty. "I am issuing my final, absolute, and legally binding ultimatum," I declared. "As the sole owner of your consolidated debt, I am officially executing my right to foreclose on your primary residence. I am giving you exactly 24 hours to pack your personal belongings and completely vacate my property. If you are not out of that mansion by noon tomorrow, I will have the local sheriff forcefully evict you onto the pavement." Catherine let out another piercing, devastated shriek, burying her face into Richard's shoulder. Richard did not even raise his arms to comfort her. He remained entirely paralyzed. Furthermore, I continued delivering the ultimate fatal strike. You thought this boardroom meeting was the only threat you faced today. You were wrong. The complete unedited file containing your fabricated collateral pledge, the forged signature, and the heavily documented evidence of your corporate embezzlement was submitted directly to the Chicago field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation at exactly 8 o'clock this morning. They are pulling up to your headquarters right now. Bradley screamed a terrifying sound of absolute defeat. Trey thrashed violently against the floor, cursing my name into the hardwood. Sloane collapsed entirely into her chair, completely catatonic. I did not offer them another second of my time. I did not linger to watch their final pathetic moments of freedom. I turned on my heel, my black suit cutting a sharp silhouette against the bright lights of the corridor. I gave a swift, silent nod to Cameron. My executive assistant immediately reached out and firmly grabbed the heavy brass handles. He pulled the thick, frosted glass doors shut with a heavy, resounding slam. The thick glass severed their desperate screams from my reality. I stood in the quiet, pristine hallway of the 50th floor, feeling an overwhelming, beautiful sense of absolute peace. The toxic chains of my past were permanently broken. I walked away, leaving them locked inside their own self-inflicted destruction, and I never looked back. 6 months passed since the heavy glass doors of my boardroom slammed shut on the Harrison dynasty. The corporate execution I orchestrated was not just swift, it was a total, unmitigated financial annihilation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation raided the Harrison Properties headquarters exactly 22 minutes after I tore their fraudulent contract in half. Agents confiscated every hard drive, froze every bank account, and locked down the building. As the sole owner of their consolidated debt, I triggered the immediate liquidation of their entire commercial portfolio. Their strip malls, their residential complexes, and their bloated corporate headquarters were sold off for pennies on the dollar. The Harrison name was completely eradicated from the Chicago real estate registry. They were stripped down to the bone. The personal fallout was even more devastating than the corporate collapse. I executed the foreclosure on their sprawling suburban mansion with absolute, unforgiving precision. I gave them 24 hours to vacate, and when the sheriff arrived the next afternoon, they were dragging trash bags filled with whatever designer clothes they could salvage. My father, Richard, the man who once demanded I fetch his coffee and banished me from his presence, now wears a cheap polyester uniform. He was forced to declare total personal bankruptcy. Stripped of his ego, his luxury vehicles, and his tailored suits, he currently works as a night shift security guard at a mid-level logistics warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He spends his nights walking the cold perimeter of a building he does not own, holding a flashlight instead of a cigar. The irony of him guarding someone else's property, while his own empire was legally dismantled by his discarded daughter, is a masterpiece of natural justice. My mother, Catherine, suffered the most brutal social descent imaginable. The local country club immediately revoked her membership the moment the federal indictments hit the news cycle. Her wealthy friends completely abandoned her, treating the Harrison name like a highly contagious disease. With her mansion repossessed and her husband bankrupt, Catherine was forced to move into a tiny, rundown one-bedroom apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood. She does not live alone in that cramped, miserable space. My sister Sloane shares that tiny apartment with her. Sloane immediately filed for a messy divorce the second the federal agents handcuffed her husband. She walked away with absolutely nothing. The court seized her designer jewelry, her luxury handbags, and the sports cars to pay back the embezzled corporate funds. The two women who spent their entire lives mocking my practical sedan and my rented apartment now rely on public transportation. They spend their days trapped in a tiny living room, surrounded by cheap furniture, bitterly blaming each other for their monumental downfall. My older brother Bradley learned a very harsh lesson about the brutal reality of the working class. His pristine, stolen Porsche was seized by the federal authorities and auctioned off to reimburse the employees he had actively defrauded. Because of his direct involvement in the corporate embezzlement and his highly publicized federal plea deal, absolutely no financial institution, will ever hire him again. The golden boy of the Harrison family now works as a waiter at a chain restaurant in the suburbs. He spends his long shifts taking orders, clearing dirty plates, and cleaning up spilled drinks for minimum wage. The intense, crushing humiliation of serving people he once considered entirely beneath him has completely broken his arrogant spirit. He is no longer a fake chief executive officer. He is just another struggling worker hoping for a decent tip. As for my former brother-in-law, Trey, his reality is bound by concrete walls and iron bars. The federal prosecutors showed him absolutely no mercy. The combination of grand larceny, massive wire fraud, and the blatant forgery of my signature on the Vanguard collateral documents resulted in a devastating sentence. Trey is currently serving 15 years in a high-security federal penitentiary. His loud, custom-tailored burgundy suits have been permanently replaced by a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The man who boldly claimed he would buy a massive luxury yacht with my company's money now sleeps on a thin mattress in a tiny cell. He has over a decade to think about the scalding cup of coffee he threw at my feet. I stood perfectly still inside my expansive corner office on the 50th floor of the Vanguard Holdings tower. The morning sun breached the horizon, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the freezing Chicago skyline. I held a delicate porcelain cup, taking a slow, calculated sip of a perfectly brewed dark espresso. The silence in my office was absolute, serene, and entirely mine. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt for the devastation I had orchestrated. I did not miss them. I did not mourn the loss of a family that had never truly existed. They had demanded a monster, and I had simply obliged them. The sleek screen of my private cellular device suddenly illuminated on the surface of my polished mahogany desk. A highly encrypted message popped up from my aggressive acquisitions director. It was a brief, highly confidential notification regarding a hostile takeover we had initiated weeks ago against a rival private equity firm. The message was simple: target acquired. The billion-dollar acquisition is finalized. You have total control. A slow, cold, and immensely powerful smile spread across my face. I set the espresso cup down on the desk. For 34 years, my bloodline told me I was a complete failure. They threw me to the wolves, expecting me to be entirely consumed. They had absolutely no idea that being banished from their toxic, decaying empire was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. Being discarded by my family was not the tragic end of my story. It was the crucial, necessary stepping stone I needed to build a solitary, untouchable financial empire. I looked out through the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the city move far below my feet. I owned the board. I held the power. And I would never let anyone look down on me ever again. The most profound lesson to extract from this ordeal is that your worth is absolutely never determined by the narrow, toxic perceptions of those who actively refuse to see your true potential. For years, being discarded by the very people who were supposed to protect you might feel like a devastating, insurmountable failure. You might quietly internalize their cruel words, mistakenly believing that you are somehow inadequate or completely undeserving of respect simply because you do not fit into their highly superficial narrative. However, the harsh reality is entirely different. Blood relations do not automatically guarantee loyalty, unconditional love, or fundamental human respect. When a family operates purely on a foundation of blind greed, emotional manipulation, and highly conditional approval, walking away from that environment is not an act of surrender. It is the ultimate necessary act of self-preservation. You do not ever need to scream your accomplishments from the rooftops or desperately beg for their validation to prove your existence. True lasting power lies in absolute silence and relentless, highly disciplined execution. Instead of wasting your valuable emotional energy trying to change the minds of arrogant people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding you, channel that exact energy into building your own independent reality. Let them constantly underestimate you. Let them blindly believe their own fabricated delusions. Their severe underestimation is actually your greatest strategic advantage. While they are busy mocking your quiet, practical life, you can steadily construct an untouchable dominant empire from the ground up. Ultimately, the absolute best revenge is never about matching their loud, chaotic cruelty or engaging in their petty drama. It is about reaching a level of personal and financial independence so absolute that their judgments simply cease to matter as you become the sole, untouchable architect of your own magnificent destiny. If you have ever had to silently cut ties with a toxic environment to aggressively build your own independent empire, share your story in the comments below and hit the subscribe button to join a community that celebrates absolute resilience.